It is my really great pleasure and honor to introduce Charlie Baillie, who is a Bay Street legend. But he didn't start out that way. He started in Aurelia, Ontario, if I remember correctly. He came to Toronto to study at the University of Toronto Schools. He took a degree at this university, and he went to Harvard Business School, where he received his MBA, and he joined the Toronto Dominion Bank. I think it's fair to say, Charlie, that the bank did not have quite the position in the marketplace when you joined it that it has today. Is that fair? And anyways, he was a big part of changing their position in the marketplace. I can't remember how long I've known Charlie, but what I enjoy about him is his intelligence, his humor, and also something you don't see that much unless you get around this city, how generous he's been. And I can think of a number of artistic endeavors which have a Baillie room or another such something named in where he provided the finances. Now, in terms of the book, could I just have one copy for 1 minute? It's called Calls of Empire from the Highlands to Hindostan. And I was seeing Charlie on another matter, and before we got into our business, he brought out this book he talked that had just been published, and I saw on the front of it the name Alexander Charles Baillie. And I was really quite confused, because I was sure Charlie hadn't written a book, even though I knew he was interested in history, so I thought, gee, he must have a son who's an academic. And then it became clear to me that it was he who wrote the book. And the reason I suggested we have him as a guest speaker, and he said, oh, well, why would your group be interested in a topic like this? And I said, Charlie, when Chris Kobrak, who is the person who inspired the creation of this association, we had a long debate of what we should be called. And Chris insisted that we were the Canadian Business History Association, not an association about Canadian business history. So this is business history. And the other thing is, I talked to Charlie, he talked about the archival research that was done, and that's something that is very important to us. And so I convinced him that this was a perfectly appropriate topic for him to talk about, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his talk. And I'm going to keep this, and I'll pay for it later with that mark.
You better watch him. Thank you, Joe, for your warm and generous comments and for adhering scrupulously to the introduction I provided to you. I want you all to know that I have resisted, albeit reluctantly, the overwhelming clamor to read 2 or 3 chapters of Call of Empire to you. And to your undoubted relief, I give you my assurance, as Henry VIII assured each of his wives, I shan't keep you long. Unlike Joe, who crafts his business histories in what seems a matter of days, I have labored over Call of Empire for ages. In fact, it took so long that I felt like the fellow who always wanted to be a procrastinator, but he never got around to it. The genesis of this project was my son Jonathan's encounter with a mysterious chest. While completing his doctorate in the UK, Jonathan ventured to Inverness, where our family's from, and inquired at the newly established Highland Archives as to the existence of any material on the Baillies of Dinane or of Lays. The archivists led him to this ancient hidebound chest, which had arrived recently from the Inverness Library, where it had lain shrouded in oblivion for the last century and a half. As they creaked open the aged chest, Jonathan was greeted by a veritable treasure trove of letters to and from our ancestors. And Jonathan and I, with great expectations, hired a local researcher to summarize and put the letters in order. And after completing her laborious assignment, the researcher stoked our enthusiasm by reporting that in her view, the more than 2,000 letters covering 5 generations, 4 of whom pursued their fortunes with more or less success in India, constituted the best collection of Highland correspondence from that era. As fate would decree, these letters were supplemented by a few hundred more in the National Archives of Scotland and a lesser number at Cambridge University. While not strictly business history related, I thought it might be of interest to read a letter with some North American flavor. It is from his brother-in-law in Inverness to Colonel William Baillie in Madras in 1776. I shall write this season a letter to your brother, which will be delivered by a young man of the name of Fraser, who has a sort of connection to you. He was last year as surgeon's mate on an Indiaman and is to return this year in the same character, intending, I believe, to remain in India if he can. Any civilities you may show him will, I dare say, be taken well by his friends in this country, and I shall be very well pleased that you find him deserving of your notice. But I cannot, after saying even this much, omit putting you a little on your guard and telling you that some years ago his character was not quite unexceptionable. But he was then very young and thoughtless, and probably his poverty was an enemy to his virtue. I hope he has since reformed, but I do not by any means intend that this recommendation, such as it is, should lead you to any risk or expense on his account. In regard to public affairs, the disputes in America still continue, and at length the Americans have thrown off their connection with Britain and formally declared themselves independent. Lord Howe, however, and his brother the General have been successful against them of late and have driven them from Long Island, New York, etc. The Generals Carleton and Burgoyne, too, have driven them out of Canada and are coming down upon the back settlements of New England and New York. And when they join the Howes, will effectively prevent all intercourse between the New England and the southern provinces, which, with the total stoppage of their trade by our ships of war, will, I hope, soon bring them back to reason and to their duty. Meantime, preparations are making for another campaign in America. God grant a speedy issue to these disputes, for while it continues, all parties suffer. There was lately some appearance of a French and Spanish war. These powers are suspected of secretly assisting the Americans, and some of their late operations seem to indicate a design of taking advantage of our present distressed circumstances and falling upon us while our whole army almost is abroad. A strong fleet of observation, however, of 16 ships of the line is getting ready with all expedition, and I hope the cloud is blown over for the present. At least the French and Spanish ministry are now giving strong assurances of a pacific disposition. Indeed, France, so much loaded with debt that I believe she hardly has credit to raise a fund for carrying on a war. Your little namesake as well, and become a very entertaining companion since he began to prattle. My first thought was to write an India-focused family history for my grandchildren, but as I examined the letters in depth, I became convinced that the light this correspondence cast on the economic and societal changes wrought by the East India Company on Britain, on the integration of India, on the integration of post-Culloden Scotland into the British Empire, on 18th and early 19th century race relationships, and on the war in America, warranted a much broader audience. One can sense from the letters that the myth of how disastrous Culloden was for Scotland is indeed a myth. Culloden admittedly was a setback for those Scots that fell supporting the Bonnie Prince. But as the English resolutely integrated Scotland into Britain, the Scots readily adapted and took advantage of the opportunities offered by empire. As James Miller observed in his book Inverness, the aftermath of Culloden, in effect a military occupation by a suspicious regime, was traumatic in the short term and the harbinger of deeper long-term changes as the Hanoverian government embarked on a strategy to draw the Highlands as fully as possible into the mainstream of British life. Union with England not only created the largest free trade zone in Europe, but also gave Scotland access to the extensive English colonies. The Scots seemed to appreciate the commercial opportunities afforded by a laissez-faire private sector more readily than did English or European merchants. And only 9 years after Culloden, Scotland emerged from its fundamental and seemingly intractable poverty to a position in which Glasgow merchants had acquired control of the international tobacco trade, Scottish trade overall had doubled, and Edinburgh was the centre of the Scottish Enlightenment, about which Voltaire asserted, "It is to Scotland that we look for our idea of civilization," and about which the normally acerbic Horace Walpole noted, "Scotland is the most accomplished country in Europe." Moreover, the clannish Northerners soon transformed the East India Company into a Scottish fiefdom, dominated the Hudson Bay Company, established Jardine Matheson and many of the great trading firms, and later in this country built the Canadian railroads and banks. Instead of becoming a trap, the Act of Union launched an economic boom. In the span of a single generation, it would transform Scotland from a third world country into a modern society and open up a cultural and social revolution. Far from finding themselves as slaves to the English, as opponents had prophesied, Scots experienced an unprecedented freedom and mobility. For the first time, the term growth began to apply to Scottish society in every sense of the word. None of this was preordained. A relatively barren, sparsely populated, and impoverished society entering into a union with the world's most advanced economy, and a union in which the political power lay in the partner's capital city, risked becoming a dependent satellite. Why is it then that Scotland, unlike Ireland, thrived in the aftermath of union? There are many reasons. First, the Scottish educational system prepared young Scots to compete effectively with their English counterparts. At a time when England prided itself on its two universities of Oxford and Cambridge, its diminutive northern neighbour boasted four: the University of St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Edinburgh. And access to those universities was available at 1/10 the cost of an English education. Moreover, basic education, spurred by the Presbyterian religion's emphasis on literacy, was much more a Scottish than an English phenomenon. Scotland in 1696 reaffirmed the requirement for a school in every parish and provided through the tax base the financial wherewithal to implement that objective. Secondly, England had sought union to attain political and military security and entertained little in the way of economic ambitions north of the border. Thirdly, Scotland had built diverse trading relationships and was not overly dependent on the English market. For example, in 1700, less than 50% of Scottish trade was with England, whereas Ireland was dependent on England for between 75% and 80% of its trade. That commercial experience meant that Scots were well positioned to take advantage of access to England's empire. Finally, members of the Scottish elite, to a much greater extent than their Irish equivalents, were committed to economic growth. They provided the impetus for agrarian reform and industrial and financial innovation, and they readily adapted the more advanced technology available in England to their needs and were soon improving upon it. As John Maynard Keynes observed, escape was possible for any man of capacity or character at all exceeding the average into the middle or upper classes. Or as Kevin Phillips more colorfully observed, braw lads raised on cold oatmeal were now spooning sturgeon eggs. Indeed, while the English authorities had ignored the advice of George II's man in the north, Duncan Forbes, to co-opt the disaffected clans by appointing their chiefs as military officers in foreign lands in order to forestall any rebellion in Scotland, virtually all the heirs of the clan chiefs who opposed George II at Culloden fought for George III in the American Revolution. In other words, the Scots were so co-opted into the British Empire by 1775 that the English could afford to indulge the Jacobite myth. The East India Company was a leviathan with extensive economic and political tentacles. Its reach was almost incomprehensible. It established the still thriving entrepôts of Hong Kong and Singapore. It governed more subjects than any country save China. It boasted the world's largest merchant navy and, almost inconceivably, controlled 50% of world trade. Positions with the EIC as the largest employer in Britain's empire and one of the few offering the prospect of a tantalizing fortune proved highly attractive to aspiring Brits, and money not infrequently changed hands to secure those coveted appointments. To place the magnitude of the Indian initiative in perspective, Richard Wellesley, as Governor General of India from 1798 to 1805, conquered more territory than Napoleon did in Europe. By 1833, the EIC controlled over 500 square miles in India, 500,000 square miles in India, with 93 million subjects, contributing in excess of 22 million pounds annually in taxation. By the second decade of the 19th century, 63 East India Company servants or alumni sat in Parliament, and Horace Walpole claimed that at least a third of parliamentarians owned East India Company shares, or more flamboyantly, was dipped in this traffic. Muslins, opium, tea, silk, and spices were all introduced to Britain by the company. The tea in that most iconic event of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, belonged to the company. The most astounding aspect, however, is the fact that the territorial expansion and extension of British rule throughout the subcontinent was a process driven not by the state, but by a private corporation. For ages, this situation occasioned virtually no debate. But as the extent of the transformation from commercial enterprise to political power became ever more evident, politicians at Westminster gradually concluded that Parliament should be involved in the governance of these subject peoples. That proved easier thought than done, as any violation of the company's chartered rights would cause other chartered bodies to rally to the East India Company's defense. Moreover, if the offices or income of the Diwani accrued to the state, George III would stoop to being a feudatory of the Mughal emperor. In addition, John Robinson, the Secretary of the Treasury and Britain's leading authority on Indian affairs, felt the inevitable errors in administering such a distant and complex territory were better blamed on the EIC's directors than on the King's ministers. And finally, many felt that a state takeover would confer such a reservoir of desirable patronage on the King and his ministers as to enable them to buy off all opposition and thus subvert the Constitution. The EIC's success in fighting a rearguard action against control by the British Parliament was gradually undermined by a devastating famine in Bengal and finally by the Indian Mutiny of 1857, after which Parliament assumed the company's possessions and armed forces. This relic of another age lingered on until its dissolution in 1874, but its legacy permeates British and Indian life to this day. In an ironic twist of fate, the moribund company was acquired in 2005 by a Jain Ranjiv Mehta from Palanpur, who now operates the East India Company as an upscale retail outlet in London's West End. The new money nabobs returning from India, together with the planters from the West Indies, were the first instance in Britain of immense wealth outside the landed gentry. Whereas the latter had inherited or purchased on the Grand Tour their arts and antiquities, most nabobs were not born to wealth. Yet the nabobs demanded art and antiques to furnish their newly acquired estates and to enhance their social status, a requirement which gave rise to the great auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, which still dominate that market today. Similarly, the company's requirements for Spanish reals gave rise to the London money market, which arguably was the catalyst for London's emergence as the world's financial center, a position for which, 400 years later, New York is its only rival. The East India Company began as an enterprise focused initially on the spice trade. It had been chartered by Queen Elizabeth I on December 31, 1600, as Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading to the East Indies. The spice trade had long been dominated by the Spanish and the Portuguese. However, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 gave the English an opening to gain a foothold. The Crown granted the new company a trading monopoly over an astonishing and expansive territory, all the lands to the east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. The first EIC mission to India in 1608 failed to wrest trading concessions from the Emperor Jahangir. However, various demonstrations of English sea power, particularly the defeat of the Portuguese at the Battle of Swally, convinced the emperor to grant the right to establish a trading post at Surat in 1612. The English proved to be irritants, but the Mughals tolerated their presence as a quid pro quo for protecting their shipping on the adjacent seas. The original charter granted the company a monopoly for 15 years, but the hefty profits realized by the EIC in India prompted James I to grant subsidiary licenses to potential English competitors. At the same time, however, James renewed the company's charter, as subsequently did Oliver Cromwell and Charles II. In a foretaste of the future, Charles II empowered a company to acquire territory, mint money, command troops, form alliances, conduct war and peace, and exercise criminal and civil jurisdiction in its lands. Monopoly was acceptable to the Crown because the company's imports yielded significant customs duties, and over time, Charles II and his brother James were able to borrow £150,000, much of which remains unpaid to this day. Yet the EIC's monopolist status was in jeopardy, since both the public and the Parliament were convinced that the company was impoverishing the country by exporting silver bullion and only importing luxury goods, while manufacturers believed that increased competition would provide better prospects for their products. In 1694, Parliament passed a deregulating act permitting any English entity to engage in the India trade. 4 years later, Parliament authorized a competing company with a state-backed indemnity of £2 million. However, the principals of the EIC subscribed for £315,000 of the issue and dominated the new firm. In practice, it soon became evident that the company's extensive infrastructure precluded any effective competition. Indeed, the EIC was the Amazon of today. And by 1708, the EIC had folded the upstart into the renamed but undeterred United Company of Merchants Trading to the East Indies. The company gradually edged out other European rivals to command trade with the two principal countries of interest, India and China. Through a combination of substantive representation in Parliament, a liberal sprinkling of company shares to members of Parliament, and continual loans to the government, the EIC was able to retain its monopoly of trade with India to 1813 and with China to 1833. For years, the company considered itself only a commercial enterprise, primarily dealing in cotton, silk, indigo, pepper, and other spices, sugar, salt, saltpeter, tea, and opium. Following the company's expulsion from Bantam in Indonesia, present-day Indonesia, however, the board of directors concluded that trading exclusively as merchants carried undue risk. Prosperity and permanence depended on the company operating in the East as a sovereign power with secure bases, adequate firepower, and efficient government. Nevertheless, the company would have been content merely to fortify its primary posts and other modest landholdings had it not been for four factors which led to the British subjugating a country that accounted in 1750 for roughly 24.4% of world GDP. Given the magnitude of its GDP, and that a few centuries earlier India had dominated Southeast Asia, in good part through soft power, it would be disingenuous to describe India as undeveloped. The factors that enabled the British to prevail were, first, the disintegration of Mughal power following the death of Aurangzeb in 1707 ended a period of relative peace and meant that the company was compelled to deal not with one recognized central power, but with numerous demanding and often contending local princes. Secondly, by 1719, France had established itself in India through La Compagnie des Indes, and with the onset of the War of the Austrian Succession in 1744, the English and French found themselves on opposing sides. When the Nawab of Hyderabad awarded the French the northern Sirkars in return for military assistance, France held the largest European-owned territory in India. The most objectionable provocation, however, was the Nawab of Bengal's award of trading concessions to the French equal to those accorded the British after countless years of patient lobbying. Thirdly, and perhaps the primary reason the British were able to triumph in India, was undoubtedly the inability of the native princes to sustain their alliances against the British. Inevitably, they loathed the British less than they loathed a rival native prince. Perhaps even more telling is the fourth factor, the phenomenon that for almost 250 years, the Mughals have been powerful enough to suppress rebellion and minimize warfare on the subcontinent. In the same period, the British were honing their military skills in the endless wars that roiled the European continent, and therefore brought to bear a much more contemporary proficiency in warfare. Warfare in India was still a sport. In Europe, it had become a science. The foregoing is why I have sought, rather than portraying a family history, to present a perspective of 18th and early 19th century Scotland, the East India Company, and India as viewed through the eyes of 5 generations of a comfortably established and relatively educated Highland family. Conscious that brevity may not be my failing, I feel it is only prudent to thank you all for listening and relinquish the podium.
Thank you very much. Because of Joe's earlier intervention, we have plenty of time for questions. Yes.
I'm really intrigued by the picture you painted of the trunk, and I'd like to hear more about the trunk. These are publicly accessible documents to begin with in Inverness that have now been transferred to the Highlands archives. Had they been cataloged at all before, or that's what the research? Or
No, they hadn't. They were just in this trunk. And I think what had happened over 5 generations, when a letter arrived, the recipient threw it in his trunk. And fortunately for us, anyway, a Baillie of Denane had married a Baillie of Lays, and so the letters went back and forth, and both families went to India. But with the trunk, we hired this woman to summarize the letters and put them in order, partly to put them in order, but so the mice wouldn't eat them also. And they're now well cataloged and in good shape and accessible. And we ended up with the trunk. I have copies of most of the letters, but they couldn't see any value in keeping the trunk. And it's made from cattle leather from cattle, a kind of cattle that no longer exists in the Highlands. So it's sort of interesting that way. My son brought that home. He wasn't here when Canada Customs called and said, who does it belong to? And we got into quite a conversation because into terms of who it belonged to. But sorry. Any other questions? Yeah, Howard?
One follow-up, just to clarify a couple of the figures that you put out. First, about the East India Company, 50% of world trade?
Yeah, that's the claim, and I've seen it a few times. It isn't just one.
So bigger than Amazon, really, for the time.
Well, by the Amazon comparison, I meant that Amazon's built such a moat that I think it's very difficult for anyone to compete. And while theoretically you could form Green and Baillie and we'd go to India, there'd be no place. The East India Company controlled the whole place, so they might not let us land our ship. It's not as if it's a state-run operation. The whole thing was owned by this company. It's a phenomenon that we certainly will never see again.
Staggering. Okay. Another figure that you mentioned was about 25%, and I didn't hear, I don't think correctly, that was 25% of GDP. That was India or the East India Company?
India was 24.5% of world GDP at that time, and China was 25 to 26. And the Indians would claim that the last 250 years was an anomaly when Europe went ahead, because most of the wealth was in that part of the world for most of our, not your and my existence, but Joe?
I don't know whether I wasn't listening carefully enough, but I didn't hear a lot about the opium trade.
No, the opium trade got going later on, and it wasn't, when my ancestors were there, it was not much of a, none of them got involved in India. I mean, in China. One was heading, one of the nephews of, I've got 2 primary characters in here, and one of the sons of the second, or the key son of the second character, I think was being shipped to China, but he died, drowned off St. Helena on the way there. But a lot of people made a lot of money in the opium trade. Jim?
Charlie, you mentioned Richard Wellesley. Is that the guy who brother of the Duke?
Yes. And
did he run the East India Company, or what was the deal?
no, Richard Wellesley was the Governor General of India,
Okay.
and his younger brother came to India commanding the army, and Wellington, as been quoted a number of times saying the Battle of Asai was the toughest battle he ever fought, which is one that he won in India. You don't hear, you hear a lot more about Waterloo. But it was interesting that they were both there at the same time.
But they weren't there on a commercial basis. They were there on a sort of a governmental basis, so to speak.
Well, that time, the East India Company really still appointed the Governor General. A little later, it switched so that the government made that appointment, but still, in effect, an employee of the East India Company for a long time. Yes?
Just curious, how did the chest end up in Scotland? Like, was there a continuing connection to Inverness over time? Did people return from India having made their fortunes?
Yes. All 5 generations, the first generation didn't go to India. The next 4 did. And once you made your money, you tended to come back, or you died in India. And about half our family died in India and half got back. And what I was saying to Jim earlier, something that really fascinated me on that was when Cornwallis lost America at Yorktown, he was appointed Governor General of India, and he decided, I'm not going to do it a second time, so I'm not going to lose India. And in his mind, the reason that the Brits lost America was that the development of a yeomanry class whose interests gradually separated from the mother country. And he figured that wouldn't happen if people didn't stay on and develop family in India. And at the outset, the company had actually encouraged its servants in India to marry into the Mughal aristocracy and so on, because the Mughals were so powerful. It was help. But when it all broke down, that wasn't useful anymore. And they went from that to Cornwallis decided, I don't want family in India. That's what family would keep people there, and they'll develop this independent yeomanry, and they'll want to separate. So he brought in a rule that no Indian spouses could attend any East India Company functions, or the children of mixed race family in India could have an appointment anymore with the East India Company, whereas previously they'd been preferred. And so it wasn't a racial thing when it was first brought in, but then racial relations deteriorated quite a bit after that. Sorry that I went off on a tangent, but it fascinated. But they did, you didn't stay in India, you came back, and if you made it, you bought a big place in Britain, and if you didn't make it.
Well, we're not like Donald Smith.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I want to go back to Scotland in the period after the defeat of Monty Prince Charlie and all the good things you said about what the English actually allowed the Scots to do by defeating them in the field of battle and so on. But could the argument be made that the Highland clearances was one of the inevitable products of sort of the Englishification of the Scottish economy, or the Scottification of the English economy?
Definitely. It was pretty poor anyway, so I think the clearances would have happened in any event, but they, I think, inevitably were accelerated by the economic progress.
Were they made more ruthless, say, by the Scots, by sort of the development of a Scots middle class and so on?
I suspect so, because after Culloden, the English really broke down the clan system and took away the powers of the clan chief, and he was no longer revered, and I think became more economic, more practical economically, whereas before it wasn't quite this way, but they were all part of the same thing. The clan chief was the clan chief, but the land was theirs and so on. Scotland really benefited, not all its people benefited. But you'd probably argue that we're all of us who were part of the clearances are better off than if we'd stayed. But the descendants. But it wasn't a pretty, especially the southern ones. Howard?
If past is prologue, and you've spent a lot of time obviously exploring the past, what are your thoughts about the evolution of the Scottish experience from here on in, based on what you know about the history?
Well, things changed, but when I was writing the book, the Royal Bank of Scotland fell apart. And my conclusion was, and so did the Bank of Scotland, and my conclusion was Scotland's too small a country to support huge banks, and so and they'll want to keep that, so they can't afford to become independent. That was before Brexit and so on. But one of the things is, in the Act of Union, the English bribed the Scots to sign it, and there were particular bribes, but they made up the losses on a thing called the Darien experience. A lot of the Scots had tried to have their own empire and lost a lot of Scottish money. And the Brits undertook to make up the damage to a lot of those landowners, and there was money left over, and the money that was left over was used to create the Royal Bank of Scotland. So I just thought that was an ironic thing, that their first attempt at being independent of the English, the money went that way, and they weren't going to be able to be independent after the collapse of the big banks, or the threatened collapse of the big banks. But it... sorry.
So you talked about the four reasons why the East India Company was able to expand so much as they did. And I completely agree with those. But what I wanted to kind of focus on was sort of the splintering of the government of the Mughal Empire, which then led me to when the East India Company was then taken over by the British government. I mean, it seemed like in both cases there was a white, the other side was able to, the splintering of the Mongols, the East India Company had a white, it was able to step into, vice versa. The East India Company had its financial problems, which government could step into. With such a large company, do you see parallels or cautionary tale for us nowadays? Certain companies getting so large, and you see a lot of sort of, not quite monopolies, but at least companies in a lot of countries.
Well, I got a concern that if you look 20 years ago, we had a lot more companies, and now the profitability is concentrated in a very few companies at the top, which I think makes us, that trend makes us less competitive. We're less likely to come up with new companies that do wonderfully well over time. It looks like the major ones if there's a new idea rather than the new idea developing into a meaningful company, it's bought up by one of the existing ones. So there's much more concentration now, and I don't think that's a good thing. It's easier to say it's not a good thing than to know how to solve it. But probably, I think there will be a trend to much stronger antitrust and fewer mergers allowed, fewer acquisitions allowed. I think when the East India Company had troubles, the Mughals' power collapsed, and then there were all these different characters that were contending. When the East India Company got financial trouble, it was a pretty seamless takeover by the Crown, so that they used many of the same people and so on. Thank you.